Greetings, friends of liberty. Regarding the North American Indians, we here in England have had scant acquaintanceship with their number, only a few having risked the dangerous voyage, though some also, quite sadly, have been kidnapped and brought against their will. Amongst these, according to various accounts, were in 1577 the Eskimo Calico, being kidnapped by the explorer Frobisher, kidnapped, however, because 5 Englishmen had themselves been kidnapped by Eskimos not a year prior. Whilst in Bristol, Calico used his boat, a small, pointy, skin-covered vessel, very maneuverably, to hunt and kill ducks with darts, he being remarkably skillful in their execution. Unfortunately, Calico, as well as a woman and infant with him, all died. Shortly thereafter, their remains not being repatriated to Baffin Island, but instead buried in the graveyard of St. Stephen's Church. Now, over 2 centuries hence, a vessel from Nantucket, Massachusetts, recently brought of his own free will this time the admirable gentleman White Feather, a Wampanoag, nattily attired in his hybrid English-Indian dress of suit coat and Indian headdress, who produced the most extraordinary effect upon the English ladies, they swooning over his regal features, handsome visage, and well-spoken manner, he quickly having mastered English. In fact, the effect was so pronounced that some of our gentlemen contemplated adding feathers to their own hair. In any case, the attentions of the ladies were so unrelenting, and at times forward beyond measure, that we gentlemen determined to give him a holiday from the feminine gaze, so to speak, allowing him to lead us on a hunting trip in the woods of my estate, during which we used ancient longbows, and he a bow fashioned in the Indian manner to hunt deer. During our excursion, he shot twice as many deer as we, though, truth be told, we were not used to the heavy draw of these giant longbows. However, after we all feasted on the venison and much else besides, he soon felt compelled by homesickness to return on the next ship to Nantucket. On the day he left, his repatriation caused an outbreak of sighs among scores of English ladies who waved their handkerchiefs from the docks, and with not a few using them to wipe away tears. Now, if we turn to the issue of repatriation, whether of the living or dead, in your own 21st century North America, we find today a timely book written in 2020 by anthropologist Elizabeth Weiss on precisely the controversy that this practice concerning here the long dead has now more and more engendered in legal and scientific communities. Weiss, tenured at San Jose State University as of 2022, was suing the administration there, which restricted her access to some of their skeletal collections. In this book, Repatriation and Erasing the Past, she argues that the changed legal environment regarding the burial of ancient human remains has damaged the rights of scientific communities to use them, instead granting Native Americans under false pretenses, and in many cases with no verifiable proof, those remains instead. She begins by defining her own discipline. Anthropology is the comparative study of human biological and cultural differences and changes through time, contrasting it with archaeology, which attempts to reconstruct the cultural systems of societies that no longer exist. She then proceeds to give us many historical examples of basic facts about the science, its progress in the Americas, as well as related anthropological discoveries, thus demonstrating to us, A, the range of its subject matter, and B, its value. She shows us, for example, how the Paleoindians, the oldest living skeletons found, are usually between 40,000 and about 7,500 years BP, before present, they almost always being morphologically distinguishable from later Native Americans or Amerindians. B, most major sites are discovered accidentally, such as when building roadways or excavating house foundations. Notable planned excavation sites, however, include the La Brea tar pits and the Channel Islands, both in California. Some sites are found by hobby or avocational anthropologists. C, in terms of estimating the age at time of death of a skeletal remain, in 1985, Owen Lovejoy and his colleagues created a method to assess age using the auricular surface, which is part of the hip bone, that included 8 age phases from ages 20 to 39. D, in other methods for aging adults, including examining cranial sutures, sutures being, of course, the junctures between the bone segments that make up our skull, the microscopic state of the bone cells found anywhere in the body, their histology, the degree of arthritis, the degree of osteoporosis, and the degree of ligament ossification. For determining sex, among the most reliable methods at plus 80% success rate is an examination of the sciatic notch in the hip bone. E, the dentition of skeletal remains can be important indicators, of course. Sometimes these show the roughness of diet. In one case, the teeth were worn down to root stubs and visibly open pulp chambers were present on the molars, which likely caused dental abscesses, as well as, through the bloodstream, osteomyelitis. In other remains, the long bones of the body can show lines called Harris lines, which occur most frequently in reasonably well-nourished people who experience periodic growth-arresting stress and correlate with illness, poor nutrition, and high parasite loads. Sometimes coprolites, petrified excrement, can be useful as well as material taken from a skeleton's intestines in understanding diet. So, for example, some examinations of coprolites show them containing human proteins, indicating that the meat the Paleoindians ate did not, in this instance, come from beef. F. As Neanderthals were more robust than Homo sapiens, so too Paleoindians had a stockier build than the later Native Americans. This allows identification. Weiss says that this may be related to activity patterns which may result in bone remodeling that strengthen the bones and also be partly genetic. G. Many obvious Paleoindians, some very unique and useful to science, such as the Pelican Rapids woman and Browns Valley man, have been claimed by the much younger Native American tribes as their own. As Weiss says, Paleoindians are being buried because some Native Americans believe they, the modern tribes, have always been there in the Americas and that the Paleoindians are ancestral to them. H. Some individual finds can be highly important. Typical examples here would be path-breaking discoveries of Ötzi, the Italian Iceman, or Lutzia, a skeleton found in Brazil dating to about 11,500 BP, which quite astonishingly appears to have African features. I. Mummified remains are often very useful and found in 4 primary areas: the arid Southwest, Southeast rock shelters, in Alaska, and on the Aleutian Islands, where in the last instance mummification was sometimes intentional. J. The DNA research on remains can often require large numbers of skeletons, from 30 to 50 minimum, from both male and female. Having introduced us to the methods of Paleoindian anthropology, Weiss now proceeds to discuss fundamental questions related to repatriation. Question number 1. How can tribal affiliation be determined? She points out that A, problematically, Native Americans have difficulty with tribal affiliation even in living peoples. Since A, for example, you can be a Navajo while being 75% another ethnic group, like Mexican or European, or B, you could be completely Native American but not have enough of any specific tribe to belong to any given tribe. B, with mitochondrial DNA, there are only 5 types linked to Amerindians, but there are 572 federally recognized tribes. So which tribe of approximately 115 on average are you going to give the body to? That has the same mitochondrial DNA. C. Even regarding the much more recent Native American skeletal remains, and not Paleoindian, only about 10% of remains can be linked to a specific tribe, and this is not done with genetics, but rather through archaeology, geography, and historical evidence. D. With many skeletal collections in museums and other institutions, which were dug up much earlier, their place of discovery and thus tribal affiliation can only remain unknown. E. American Indian tribes have moved so often for so many different reasons, such as drought, famine, forced relocation, or war, that the presence of a given tribe often has no affiliation with local skeletons. F. A further revision of Code 13 of a law called NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, is at the heart of the controversy and now allows tribes to repatriate remains without proving affiliation. By default, the remains go to the Indians. The result of this disregard of property rights, increasing removal of skeletal remains from universities and museums. Now to question number 2. How do the Paleoindians relate to other Native Americans? A. Kennewick Man, whose case I'll discuss more later, was a famous Paleoindian skeleton unearthed in 1996. His skull was found to be distinct enough that the district court had heard the scientist's case against reburial, made the decision that physical features of Kennewick Man appeared dissimilar to all modern American Indians, including claimants. DNA tests did find that Kennewick Man's DNA was similar to that of Native Americans, but there was no way to attribute it to any particular tribe. B. One study found that less than 10% of Paleoindian skulls showed enough cranial similarity to be classified as Amerindian. C. In many cases, neither DNA similarity nor skeletal matching exists. So, for example, the Buell burial from Idaho, which dates back 10,000 years and had Polynesian features, the Browns Valley Man at 8,900 years old, and Pelican's Rapids woman at 7,900 years old, all were reburied without any skeletal or DNA proof of affiliation. They just gave them to the nearest tribe. Science and property rights be damned. Question number 3. How were the Americas populated? A. Contrary to all archaeological evidence, many Indian origin myths claim their tribes were here forever. A typical example involves the Iroquois legend that their tribesmen came to Earth after an ancestral female fell in a waterhole and was saved by a large sea turtle that was summoned by birds. And one tribal leader of the Pueblo of Zuni in New Mexico stated that Native Americans did not need scientists to tell them about heritage. No, they just divined it during peyote-induced trance states. B. There are many pieces of evidence that a crossing across the Bering Strait or land bridge occurred A typical one being that the DNA of Native Americans is similar to a haplotype found in Altai populations from Mongolia. C. Weiss believes that the fact that the older dating of some sites in the U.S., the 14,800-year-old Meadowcroft Rock Shelter site in Pennsylvania, and the over 14,500-year-old Chilean Monteverde site, indicate that other routes of colonization aside from the Beringia, for example by open sea lanes along the west coast, may also have been used. D. Language clues, too, play a role in deciphering who arrived when, since, for example, the Inuit have a unique language among Indians. E. Incidentally, the whole issue of how densely or sparsely North and South America were settled pre-contact is contentious and much debated. Some scientists or websites on the high side estimate from 22 to 112 million for North America alone, whereas Weiss argues for a much lower figure of between 1.8 to 2.5 million. Her reasoning is, A, the amount of human-produced carbon, as in campfires, estimated continent-wide, is low, and B, significant evidence that widespread droughts and famines decreased overall population in North America after 950 AD. Now let's move to a discussion of some of the absurd fallacies found in repatriation ideology. They number, among others, A, the belief that American Indians, instead of getting horses from the Spanish conquistadors, instead always had horses. So, for example, some Blackfoot Indians recited stories that a particular Blackfoot man or boy was given horses by spirits of the water or spirits of the air, such as the Thunderbird or Morning Star. B. Repatriation ideology also claims, like Sebastian Junger did in his book Tribe, that the Indians were very egalitarian. But there are many instances where this is not true. Typical examples are the social stratification found in Aztec, Mayan, and Inca societies, and the Cahokia, with their large settlement in Ohio, with lots of apparent slave sacrifices. Other tribes turned out to have many slaves as well, this being fairly common among the Illinois and in southern, southwestern, and plains tribes. C. It is often claimed that the Indians were peaceful pre-contact, but this is about the biggest fiction of all, with many skeletons testifying to the receipt of brutal injuries, craniofacial or penetrative. Also, evidence of cannibalism and, as mentioned, human sacrifice abounds, a typical example being the Morning Star sacrifice of the Pawnee, which involved killing a single young female who had been captured from a foreign tribe. D. With regard to disease and mortality, she argues that A. the Indians also engaged in germ warfare, like the Europeans did against both Indians and colonists, and B. smallpox deaths among Native Americans were likely a result of localized populations being infected rather than a large pandemic across the Americas. C. that diseases like syphilis actually had a source of origin in the Americas, irrespective of whether there was a European origin. D. infant mortality pre-contact was perhaps 40%. And E. the increased transition to large-scale agriculture found, for example, among the Mayans, actually was outstripped by the increased population, resulting in a lower standard of living generally and more susceptibility to disease. These are all her contentions. She next turns to an examination of the laws that regulate the disposal of Indian remains. Let's briefly examine the most important. A. Presently, the government regards Indian tribes as domestic dependent nations, whose care is entrusted to the U.S. government. One consequence being that Indian tribes and corporations cannot be sued without their permission or are immune from suit. B. In 1996, Congress passed a statute calling the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which was just aspirational, having no actual effect. However, President Clinton used that statute as the basis of an executive order directing federal agents to preserve Indian sacred sites and accommodate Indian access to those sites. C. Various tribes have now used this aspirational act to try to limit public access to various sites that they call or regard as religious. Typical examples being the Chimney Rock section of Six Rivers National Forest in California, or parts of the Little Tennessee River Valley that are a part of Cherokee religious practices. D. Many statutes dealing with conservation, such as the National Historic Preservation Act, grant Indian tribes and Indian peoples interests that are not granted to other ethnic groups. So, for example, Indians are often given leeway to kill bald eagles, which would result in criminal prosecution for anyone else. E. Of all recent developments, the previously mentioned law, NAGPRA, and its revisions are the most damaging. It initially only required repatriation for funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony where cultural affiliation is established. But the whole point is that cultural affiliation in most cases is not and cannot be established. F. Weiss describes the Kennewick Man case in great detail, it involving an accidental discovery of a nearly complete 9,000-year-old human skeleton along the south bank of the Columbia River in Oregon in 1996. The case eventually settling many legal precedents. Initially, a number of court decisions decided in favor of the anthropologist's right to study the remains. However, as a direct response to these rulings, the increasingly politically correct U.S. Congress itself passed a law to repatriate the remains to the coalition of tribes that had intervened in the suit. G. Some Indian tribes claim that any DNA research, either of Indian or Paleoindian remains, that investigates subject matters that might reflect badly on them should be shut down. A typical case involved the Havasupai, a small isolated tribe located at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, who initially agreed to participate in DNA research, but then sued when they didn't like the conclusions drawn. They have a propensity to schizophrenia and inbreeding. The Havasupai collected $700,000 for their suffering, fright, anguish, rage, and shock. Weiss concludes here, to the Havasupai and other tribes, inbreeding is taboo, and the publication of information suggesting a high inbreeding coefficient implies that members of the Havasupai had been violating that taboo. Someone may need to fess up. In conclusion, I'd give this book an A-. She, number one, shows convincingly that somewhere between 90 to 99% of Paleoindian finds cannot be associated with any particular tribe, by what should be the normal rules of property disposal for human remains. By my conception, if you can't show direct relation to someone in your direct past, such as a grandfather or great-grandfather, then the remains should belong to the discoverer. The issue is complicated by the extensive federal ownership of public lands, all of which, in my view, should be sold to depoliticize their use for many purposes, such as energy exploration, with Biden stifling it, the control of forest fires, with private landowners preventing them much better than the Forest Service, and thirdly, for anthropological and archaeological productivity, as Weiss here describes. Number two, she shows at length how woke, politically correct, and postmodernist ideology treating Indians as a privileged victim group has damaged both litigation on this issue and academic understanding among the professoriate and general public. As described, it even affected the United States Congress. Number 3, the only thing I wish she had covered a bit more was the arguments of those who believed that the death toll from the introduction of Western diseases in the Americas was very high. Here she didn't really address the strengths of the counter-arguments. Other than that, this was very informative and well argued. Happy for my part that in my will I stipulate that my bones be buried right here on my estate on this precious stone set in a silver sea. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.